The receptionist's scornful laugh cut through the air-conditioned room like a sharp blade. Thomas stood still, his calloused hands clutching the worn leather briefcase that carried 43 years of dreams and the savings of a lifetime. Reflected on the polished floor of the airplane dealership, his threadbare navy blue suit looked even more out of place amidst the executives moving about with branded briefcases and artificial smiles. "Are you sure you haven't gotten the wrong address?" the young woman behind the marble counter asked, her voice dripping with condescension. "The hardware store is 2 blocks down." Her words struck Thomas like slaps, yet he maintained the upright posture Eleanor had always admired. Eleanor. Is Eleanor. Her name still burned in his chest like a live ember, even a year after her passing. It was the thought of her, the gentle smile that had accompanied him for over 4 decades, that stopped him from turning on his heel and fleeing the hostile environment. 6 hours earlier, as he adjusted the knot of his tie for the 3rd time in front of the stained bathroom mirror, Thomas replayed the promise that had brought him there. Eleanor, lying in the hospital bed, her blue eyes still sparkling with that light that had illuminated his entire life, held his hand with surprising strength. "Promise me you'll fulfill our dream, Thomas? Promise me you'll touch the skies for both of us." The memory was so vivid he could almost smell the lavender perfume she always wore. Eleanor, with her elegant simplicity and dreams larger than the horizon, had transformed a shy young man from the countryside into a determined man. She had taught him that dignity wasn't measured by the thickness of one's wallet but by the strength of one's character. "Sir?" The receptionist's impatient voice snapped him back to the present. "If you don't have an appointment?" "I'm here to buy a plane," Thomas declared, his voice steady like the roots of the century-old trees on his farm. The silence that followed was absolute, broken only by muffled laughter from a group of executives near the showroom. News of his presence spread through the dealership like wildfire. Employees emerged from their cubicles, some not even attempting to hide their incredulity, others exchanging amused glances. A man in an Italian suit and a gold watch approached, his smile as fake as the plastic plants decorating the room. "May I help you?" he asked, each syllable laced with superiority that made Thomas's blood boil. "Our planes are, well, let's just say they come at a considerable price." Thomas thought of Emma, his lawyer granddaughter, who had begged to come with him the night before. "Grandpa, let me go with you. I know how to deal with these people." But he had refused. Some battles, as Eleanor always said, a man has to fight alone. The sale of half his land still weighed on his heart like a stone. Land his family had cultivated for 3 generations, which he and Eleanor had turned into one of the most prosperous orchards in the region. Now, those acres would transform into the dream his wife hadn't been able to live out in her lifetime. "Do you even know the price of our planes?" the salesman continued, his tone wavering between amusement and irritation. "Our most basic aircraft costs more than many entire farms." Thomas opened his briefcase with calculated calm, his fingers trembling not with nerves but with a contained fury that threatened to overflow. Inside, alongside documents meticulously organized by Emma, was the check for the land sale. A sum that would melt that smug grin like snow under the sun. The morning he decided to sell the land was still vivid in his memory. Sitting on the porch of his century-old house, watching the sunrise paint the fields his family had farmed for generations in golden hues, Thomas cried for the first time since Eleanor's funeral. They weren't tears of sadness but of resolve. Eleanor had always said that sometimes you have to let go of something precious to achieve a dream even more valuable. The journey to the city that morning had been a passage through time. Every bend in the road held a memory. His first meeting with Eleanor at the county fair, where she sold apple pies that made the judges sigh in delight. Their simple wedding at the local church, witnessed by only the dearest friends and family. The birth of Rachel, their daughter, now a respected teacher in the capital. The hard times during droughts, when only love and faith kept them standing. And always that dream. It began on a Sunday afternoon when a small plane flew over their land. Eleanor, with that smile that could make flowers bloom in the desert, pointed to the sky and said, "One day we'll be up there, Thomas. We'll see our land from above and touch the clouds with our own fingers." Now, standing amidst the barely disguised scorn of those who judged him by his appearance, Thomas felt Eleanor's presence stronger than ever. It was as if she were there, her delicate hands resting on his shoulders, whispering words of courage into his ear. "Actually," Thomas said, his voice calm despite the storm within, "I have a very clear idea of the price." He pulled the check from his briefcase, the simple piece of paper bearing the weight of decades of hard work and deferred dreams. "And I'm prepared to pay in full." The silence following his declaration was deafening. The salesman, who moments earlier radiated arrogance, now stared wide-eyed at the check. The laughter stopped, replaced by stunned quiet. Thomas felt a wave of bittersweet satisfaction as he observed the shifting expressions around him. It wasn't revenge he sought. Eleanor always said revenge was a poison one drank hoping the other would die. It was something greater: dignity, justice, and the fulfillment of a sacred promise. Perhaps, he continued, adjusting the knot of his tie with his calloused hands, we can now discuss airplanes as equals. The morning sun streaming through the dealership's towering windows seemed to smile upon Thomas. Somewhere he was certain Eleanor was smiling too. The check in his hands changed everything, and nothing. Thomas watched as the faces around him transformed instantly. Sneering smiles morphed into servile expressions, looks of disdain gave way to exaggerated attentiveness. It was like witnessing a grotesque dance where masks fell one by one, exposing the true nature of everyone present. Mr. Thompson, the lead salesman who had treated him with contempt only moments earlier, now approached with a smile as broad as it was insincere. I must apologize for the misunderstanding. I'm Richard Maxwell, Senior Sales Manager. Please, allow me to escort you to my private office. A bitter taste filled Thomas's mouth. Eleanor's words echoed in his memory. True wealth, my love, lies in the character we uphold when no one is watching. He stood still, his gaze fixed on the people still whispering in the corners of the dealership. No, he replied with a calmness that surprised even himself. We'll handle this right here where everyone can see and hear. The tension in the room grew like a silent wave. A young saleswoman, who moments earlier had openly laughed at his presence, now studied her shoes with sudden interest. The security guard by the door, who had watched him suspiciously since his arrival, suddenly found something fascinating to observe through the windows. Richard Maxwell cleared his throat, visibly uneasy. Mr. Thompson, financial matters of this magnitude are typically handled with more discretion. Discretion? The word left Thomas's mouth like a stone. There wasn't much discretion when everyone here was laughing at me, was there? The silence that followed was absolute. Thomas felt the weight of every gaze, every held breath. In his mind, Eleanor wore that smile she always reserved for the moments when he showed a strength he didn't even know he had. A sudden memory flooded his mind. Eleanor, sitting in her rocking chair on the porch, watching a small airplane cross the sky above their land. You know, Thomas, she said that afternoon, sometimes people confuse simplicity with simplicity of spirit. But it's our dreams that define us, not the clothes we wear. I want to see all the models, Thomas continued, his voice growing stronger. And I want each specification explained right here in front of everyone. Because today, I'm not just buying an airplane. I'm buying a lesson about judging people by appearances. Emma arrived at the dealership like a whirlwind 15 minutes later. Her well-tailored suit and expensive leather briefcase contrasted with her grandfather's simplicity, but her green eyes sparkled with the same determination. Thomas saw her enter and felt a mix of pride and concern. His granddaughter had the warrior spirit of Eleanor. Grandpa? She approached, casting stern glances at the staff. I got your message. Are you okay? Thomas nodded, realizing his hands were still trembling slightly. Not from fear or anger but from contained emotion. I'm fine, dear. But I think I'll need a lawyer. Emma understood immediately. Her professional gaze swept the room, taking in every detail, every person present. She had inherited not only Eleanor's intelligence but also her ability to read situations and people. Mr. Maxwell, she addressed the manager with a professional coldness that made him shrink imperceptibly, I assume you have security cameras here? The manager paled. Yes, of course, but... Great. I'll need the footage from the last 30 minutes, Emma said, opening her briefcase and pulling out a notebook. And I'll also want the full names of every employee present. Thomas watched his granddaughter with a mixture of admiration and melancholy. Emma was so much like Eleanor at 30, the same fierce determination, the same unwavering sense of justice. He remembered when she was only 6 years old, standing up for a classmate who was being bullied at school. Eleanor had smiled that day and said, "That girl has fire in her heart, Thomas." Just like her grandmother. The atmosphere in the dealership shifted again. Fear began to replace the discomfort on the faces around them. A younger employee who had not been part of the earlier mockery, approached Emma hesitantly. "Miss," she said softly, "my name is Lucy Chen. I want to testify about what happened here today." Emma smiled gently at the young woman, jotting down her contact information. Thomas felt a warmth in his chest. There was goodness even in the most unlikely places, just as Eleanor had always insisted. "Mr. Thompson," a different voice spoke. An older man with graying hair and tired eyes emerged from an office in the back. I'm Robert Williams, the owner of this dealership. I'd like to speak with you and your lawyer privately. There was something in Robert's voice that made Thomas take special notice, a note of sincerity that stood out amidst the surrounding falsehoods. As they followed Robert to his office, Thomas couldn't help but notice how the man limped slightly on his right leg. Emma walked beside him, tense and protective. The office was surprisingly modest compared to the ostentatious luxury of the showroom. Old photos decorated the walls, planes from various eras, some clearly used for agricultural work. One showed a young Robert standing beside a tractor. But it was another photo that caught Thomas's attention, an elderly man with calloused hands and a dignified gaze, holding a straw hat. "My father," Robert said softly, noticing Thomas's gaze. "James Williams. He started as a farmer, then moved into agricultural equipment. He taught me everything I know about hard work and dignity." Thomas felt something shift in the room. It wasn't just the shared history, it was a deeper recognition, a connection that transcended the circumstances of the day. "What happened here today is unforgivable," Robert continued, sinking heavily into his chair. "I won't try to justify or minimize it. In fact, I've been noticing for some time how this dealership has strayed from the values my father taught me." He opened a drawer and pulled out an old file. "This is the model I believe you're looking for. It's a perfect airplane for small properties, economical and safe. And I'll sell it to you at cost." Emma began to protest, but Thomas raised his hand, signaling for silence. There was something more happening here, something that went beyond a simple business transaction. "Why?" he asked simply. Robert hesitated, his eyes drifting back to the photo of his father. "Because today your presence here made me remember all the lessons I've been forgetting. You know, Mr. Thompson, my father used to say that a man can lose everything in life, except his dignity. And today, seeing you face all this prejudice with such strength, well, it was like hearing his voice again." Thomas felt tears welling up in his eyes. They weren't tears of sadness or anger, but of recognition. In Robert, he saw a distant reflection of himself, a man torn between two worlds, struggling not to lose his essence. "The airplane is just part of what needs to be fixed here," Emma interjected, her voice professional but no longer hostile. "We need to ensure that what happened today never happens again." Robert nodded, a sad smile tugging at his lips. "I completely agree. And that's why, in addition to the airplane, I'd like to propose something more. Something that might begin to repair not just the damage caused today, but an entire culture that allowed this to happen." Thomas gazed out the office window, watching the blue sky he would soon explore. Eleanor always said that the greatest changes often started in the most unexpected moments. Maybe this was one of those moments. Robert Williams rose from his chair, his movements slow, revealing not just the weight of his years, but also the memories he carried. His fingers brushed the surface of an old photograph on the wall, the image of a wheat field at sunset, a small agricultural plane cutting through the orange sky like a solitary bird. "You know, Mr. Thompson," Robert began, his voice soft, laden with memories, "this was the first plane I ever sold. The buyer was a man very much like you, calloused hands, simple clothes, but his eyes, oh, his eyes, they gleamed with dreams bigger than the horizon." Thomas felt something familiar in those words, a distant echo of his own journey. Beside him, Emma watched intently, her green eyes, so like Eleanor's, catching every nuance of the moment. "Back then," Robert continued, easing himself back into his chair with difficulty, "this dealership was nothing more than a tin-roofed shed. I still had dirt under my nails and the smell of the field on my clothes. We were a family business in the truest sense of the word." "What changed?" Thomas asked gently, recognizing in Robert's words his own struggle to stay true to his roots. Robert fell silent for a moment, his eyes lost in the memories. "Success," he finally answered. "The kind of success that comes with a price you only realize you've paid when it's too late." He opened a drawer of the desk, his hands trembling slightly as he pulled out a yellowed envelope. "My father tried to warn me. He spent his last years telling me that I was losing much more than just my roots." Thomas felt a tightness in his chest. Eleanor's words came rushing back with full force. "Sometimes we need to lose our way to find our true direction." "I found this last night," Robert said, his voice choked with emotion. "The last letter from my father. He wrote it in the hospital just days before he passed." With careful reverence, he opened the envelope and began to read aloud. "My dear son, by the time these words reach you, I will have gone to join your mother in the stars. There is so much I wanted to tell you, so much I tried to teach you over the years. But perhaps my greatest failure was not being able to show you that success without soul is like a plant without roots. It may look beautiful on the outside, but it won't survive the first storm. I remember it as if it were yesterday, the day we sold our first airplane. Your eyes shone with so much pride, so many dreams. And they were good dreams, son. Honest dreams. But at some point, the shine of money began to outshine the humanity in your eyes. I leave you my final dream, that project I never managed to complete. Use it to give back to the land and to the simple people some of the dignity the world insists on denying them. Because in the end, son, it's not the numbers in our bank account that tell our story, but the smiles we plant along the way. With eternal love, your father. The silence that followed the reading was heavy with emotion. Emma discreetly wiped away a tear, while Thomas thought of Eleanor and how she always said that there were no coincidences, only encounters destined by time. There's more, Robert said, standing up again. He walked over to a picture on the wall and removed it, revealing a small safe. With precise movements, he dialed the combination and pulled out an old photograph, his fingers caressing the surface as if touching a sacred relic. This photo was taken 40 years ago at the old county fair, he explained, extending the image to Thomas. My father kept it until the end. Thomas took the photo with trembling hands and his heart stopped for a moment. There was Eleanor, young and radiant, her smile lighting up the small pie stand where she worked. And beside her, almost out of frame, was James Williams, Robert's father, savoring a slice of pie with an expression of pure joy. My father never forgot that apple pie, Robert said softly. He mentioned it at least once a month. He always said that the secret wasn't just in the recipe, but in the love with which it was made. He used that story as an example of how we should treat people, with genuine care and respect. Tears were now flowing freely down Thomas's face. Eleanor, he whispered. My Eleanor always said her pies were a way of sharing love with strangers. Emma held her grandfather's hand, her own eyes brimming with tears. Grandma used to say that every pie carried a special blessing. And she was right. Robert smiled, his eyes shining with a new purpose. As she always was. And that's why I have a proposal to make. He opened another drawer and took out a thick folder, carefully preserved. This is the project my father dreamed of completing. A special funding program for small farmers, allowing them to modernize their operations with agricultural planes. But it's more than that, it's a project of social transformation. As Robert explained the details, Thomas felt his heart swell with possibilities. It wasn't just about buying a plane now, it was about turning his experience of humiliation into hope for others who, like him, had dreams bigger than their resources. I want you to be not just our first beneficiary, but our partner in this project, Robert continued. Your story, your dignity, your strength of character, they are exactly what we need to bring this dream to life. Emma, who had been studying the documents with professional attention, lifted her eyes. This will require significant changes in the dealership's corporate culture. Precisely, Robert nodded. And that's why I want you as our legal consultant, Emma. Your passion for justice, combined with your corporate law experience, can help us transform this place from the inside out. Thomas watched the interaction between his granddaughter and Robert with a soft smile. Eleanor always said that the greatest blessings sometimes came disguised as challenges. Here was the living proof of her words. We'll start with a mandatory awareness program for all employees, Robert continued. New service policies, real consequences for discriminatory behaviors. I want to turn this dealership into the kind of place my father dreamed of, where character matters more than appearances. When do we start? Thomas asked, his voice firm despite the emotions that surged within him. Robert smiled, a genuine smile that lit up his tired face. How about right now? After all, as your Eleanor and my father taught us, there's no better time to do the right thing than the present. Thomas looked out the window at the sky he would soon explore. It was no longer just his personal dream that was about to come true, it was the beginning of something bigger, something that could touch and transform many other lives. Eleanor always said dreams have wings of their own, he said softly. We just need the courage to let them fly. Lucy Chin arrived at the dealership earlier that morning, her hesitant steps echoing on the marble floor that still held the memories of the day before. At the reception, where cruel laughter had pierced the air yesterday, now there was a thoughtful silence. The first light of the day painted soft shadows on the glass walls, as if nature itself wanted to soften the edges of the place. Other employees began arriving slowly, their gazes different from the usual. The air of superiority that once dominated the space had been replaced by something closer to humility. Richard Maxwell, who had led the mockery against Thomas the day before, now carried the visible weight of regret on his shoulders. Thomas and Emma arrived with Robert. The contrast between Thomas's simple suit and the dealership's luxurious surroundings remained the same, but something fundamental had shifted. It was no longer Thomas who seemed out of place. It was the very environment that now seemed too artificial, too cold, too distant from the true essence of what it should have been. Robert led everyone to the main office, which had been rearranged overnight. The chairs formed a perfect circle, eliminating invisible barriers of status and power. On the walls, alongside pictures of luxurious airplanes, were now old images from the dealership's history, including that first photo of the wheat field at sunset. "Before we begin," Robert said, his voice gentle but firm, "I want everyone to look around. Look at each other's faces. Not as colleagues, not as superiors or subordinates, but as people. People with stories, dreams, fears, and regrets." Lucy felt her hands tremble slightly. The night before, she had barely slept, the memories of her grandmother blending with the images of the day. Beside her, a colleague from the finance department, Amanda Porter, always so polished and distant, also showed signs of unease. "Yesterday," Robert continued, "we witnessed the worst and the best of who we are. I saw on each of your faces a reflection of something that also existed in me, that empty pride that confuses value with appearance. But today we begin a new story. And for that, I need to share something personal with you all." He picked up the old photo, the one where Eleanor is smiling beside her father at the county fair. The image, passed hand to hand in the circle, seemed to carry not just memories but long-forgotten truths. "This woman was Eleanor Thompson," Robert explained, his voice soft with reverence. 40 years ago she baked the best apple pies in the county. My father kept this photo until his last day, not because of the pie, but because of what she represented: genuine kindness that asks for nothing in return. Amanda Porter was the first to break the silence that followed. Her voice, normally controlled and professional, trembled slightly. "My mother used to sell sweets too," she said, surprising everyone. "In fact, that's how she paid for my college. I never tell anyone that. I've always been ashamed." Lucy watched as Amanda's hands tightened around Eleanor's photo before passing it along. In her eyes, there was the unmistakable shine of restrained tears. Richard Maxwell then stood up, his face a canvas where conflicting emotions painted a story of pain. "I need to say something," he began, his voice breaking. "Mr. Thompson, what I did yesterday, there's no excuse. But I need you to understand why I acted the way I did." The silence in the room hung heavy, like a winter blanket. Thomas, sitting between Emma and Robert, kept his eyes fixed on Richard, his gaze not one of judgment but of understanding. "My father was also a farmer," Richard continued, his words now flowing like water from a dam. "We had a small property out west. The drought 15 years ago took everything: the crops, the cattle, the hope. He couldn't take it. One Sunday morning after the service Richard paused, took a deep breath. "We found the letter on the porch. He had gone to the barn." Lucy saw Amanda Porter quietly rise and walk toward Richard, offering him a handkerchief. The simple gesture, so unlike the formal interactions that usually dominated the space, seemed to break something in the air. "I promised myself I would never be poor again," Richard continued, his voice now steadier. "Never again would I be simple. I built this person you all know, the flawless manager, always well-dressed, always superior. But when I saw you yesterday, Mr. Thompson, in your simple clothes and calloused hands, it was like seeing my father. And I couldn't take it. It was easier to laugh, to scorn, than to face my own demons." Lucy felt something stir in her chest, a courage she hadn't known she had. "I have a story too," she said, her voice soft but clear. "My grandmother, she was like Mrs. Eleanor. She sold cakes at a booth at the farmer's market. People laughed at her broken English, the simple clothes she wore. But she kept her head high, always saying that dignity can't be bought with money." One by one the stories began to emerge. Amanda Porter revealed how she had secretly continued to visit the small diner where her mother had worked, always after hours when no one from the dealership could see her. Mark Stevens, from the marketing department, shared how his grandfather lost everything in the Great Depression but kept his integrity intact, teaching him that character was worth more than money. Thomas watched each revelation with misty eyes, feeling in each story an echo of Eleanor's wisdom. "People are like gardens," she used to say. "Sometimes you have to dig deep into the soil of the soul to find the most beautiful flowers." Emma, sitting beside him, had completely abandoned her professional demeanor. Tears ran freely down her face as she held her grandfather's hand, as if through that touch she could convey all the love and pride she felt. Robert waited for the last story to be shared before standing once more. "That's why," he said, his voice heavy with emotion, "our new program is not just about corporate training or anti-discrimination policies. It's about healing. about reconnecting with our own stories, with our humanity. He then revealed his own truth. The story of the first plane he sold, not the polished version he had told for years, but the raw and beautiful truth. That first buyer was my own father, he confessed, pointing to the photo of the wheat field. He sold half of our land to give me a start in this business. At the time, I felt ashamed. I wanted people to think my first customer was some rich farmer, not my father with his calloused hands and simple dreams. Lucy watched as each word from Robert touched those present in different ways. Richard Maxwell had lowered his head, his hands covering his face. Amanda Porter held Eleanor's photo as if it were a precious treasure. Mark Stevens stared out the window, but his eyes seemed to see something far beyond the urban horizon. Today, 40 years later, Robert continued, Thomas Thompson walks through that door, and it's as if my father is giving me a second chance. A chance to do things the right way this time. The silence that followed was no longer one of embarrassment or shame. It was a silence of transformation, of recognition, of possibilities. Lucy thought of her grandmother, how she always said, only love has the power to transform shame into honor. Then Thomas stood up, his calloused hands holding Eleanor's photo. My wife, he said softly, always believed that there are no coincidences. Every encounter, every moment carries a lesson we need to learn. Yesterday I came here to fulfill a dream, to buy a plane. Today I realize that the true flight we need to take is a different one. The flight of dignity, of understanding, of recognizing our shared humanity. Thomas's words lingered in the air like flower petals in the wind. Lucy noticed how the sunlight, now stronger through the windows, seemed to embrace each person present, as if nature itself wanted to take part in that moment of transformation. The dream of flying, which had begun as a whispered promise to Eleanor on her deathbed, now took on dimensions that transcended the physical. It was no longer just about touching the clouds, it was about lifting the human spirit to heights no plane could ever reach. The sun was still just a promise on the horizon when Thomas arrived at the dealership's private airstrip. The dew covered the asphalt runway like thousands of tiny diamonds, each drop reflecting the soft morning light. He paused for a moment, breathing in the fresh morning air, letting the memories of Eleanor fill his heart. Emma stood beside him, her young face marked by a mix of pride and worry. From a young age, she had heard the story of her grandparents' dream to fly as a bedtime tale. The farmer and the baker who wanted to touch the clouds. Now, seeing her grandfather about to fulfill that dream, she could hardly hold back her tears. Lucy Chin arrived shortly after, carrying a package that emanated a sweet, familiar scent. Her hands trembled slightly as she approached. Mr. Thompson, she said softly, I know it might seem bold, but I spent the whole night making this. She extended the package wrapped in simple brown paper. It's a family recipe. Thomas carefully unwrapped it, and the scent of cinnamon and apple filled the morning air. The pie was still warm, and for a moment, a precious, bittersweet moment, he felt as if Eleanor were right there. My grandmother always said that recipes are more than just instructions, Lucy continued, her voice low but firm. They're love stories passed down through generations. When she fled China during the Cultural Revolution, this recipe was one of the few things she brought with her. At that moment, Richard Maxwell appeared, carrying an old leather folder. His face showed signs of a sleepless night, but his eyes had a different gleam, as though he had discovered something precious and urgent to share. I spent the night in the dealership's old files, he explained, approaching the group. After our conversation yesterday, something was bothering me. A half-forgotten memory, something my father used to mention. He opened the folder and pulled out an old photograph. The paper was yellowed at the edges, but the image remained clear. The county fair more than 40 years ago. Eleanor's pie booth in the foreground, her radiant smile forever captured in that moment. And in the sky, leaving a soft trail between the clouds, a small airplane. This airplane, Richard said, his voice trembling with contained emotion, belonged to my father. He used to do small shows at local fairs. He said it was his way of sharing the magic of flight with people who could never afford a ticket. Thomas held the photo with trembling hands. It was on this day, he whispered. Eleanor pointed to the sky and said that one day we would touch the clouds together. Michael Harrison, the flight instructor chosen by Robert, joined the group. There was something in his eyes, a natural kindness, a deep understanding, that made everyone feel at ease. You know, Michael began as he prepared the small plane for the first lesson, I learned to fly with my father. He was a farmer too, but he had a different dream. He used to say that the higher we fly, the more clearly we see that all the fences dividing the land are creations of our own making. From up there it's all one thing. Lucy set up a small improvised table under the wing of the airplane, placing the still warm pie in the center. The sweet aroma blended with the scent of wet grass and aviation fuel, a strange combination that somehow felt perfectly fitting for the moment. Robert arrived carrying hot coffee for everyone in an old large thermos. This thermos, he explained with a nostalgic smile, belonged to my father. He used to take it every morning when we'd go out to check the crops. He said that coffee shared tastes different. As they served the coffee and pie, Richard cleared his throat nervously. "There's one more thing," he said, pulling a folded envelope from his suit pocket. "After finding that photo, I called my mother last night. We spent hours talking, for the first time in years really talking. She found my father's journal." The group fell silent as Richard carefully unfolded the yellowed pages with reverent care. His voice, usually controlled and professional, trembled as he began to read. September 15, 1980. "Today I saw something at the county fair that reminded me why I started flying. A young woman was selling pies. Not just pies but pieces of happiness in food form. Her smile lit up the entire place, and the way her husband looked at her, it was as if she were the very sun. I made sure to fly low over her booth. I saw when she pointed to the sky, her eyes shining with that kind of dream that many call impossible. But I know better. There are no impossible dreams, only people who give up too soon on achieving them." Tears freely streamed down Thomas's face. Emma gripped his hand tightly, while Lucy discreetly passed napkins to everyone. "There's more," Richard continued, his voice now stronger. A few pages later he wrote, "Sometimes I think that we, who have the privilege of flying, have a greater responsibility. It's not just about reaching the sky, it's about showing people that there is always a different perspective, a broader horizon, a possibility to see the world in a new way." Michael, who had been preparing the plane, stepped closer to the group. "Before we begin the practical lesson," he said softly, "there's a tradition among pilots. A moment of silence before the first flight, not out of fear or superstition but out of respect. Respect for the sky we're about to explore, for the dreams we're going to realize, for the stories that have brought us here." Everyone stood in silence, naturally forming a circle around the makeshift table. The sun was now higher, painting the sky a deep blue that seemed to call to them. Lucy served another round of pie, and Thomas noticed how her hands, young yet already marked by years of dedicated work, resembled Eleanor's. The same care in cutting each slice, the same love transformed into simple gestures. "Before we take off," Thomas said, his voice calm yet clear, "I want to thank all of you. Eleanor always used to say that true miracles happen when people open their hearts to each other. I look at each of you here and I see that miracle unfolding." Robert smiled, his eyes sparkling with held-back tears. "It's not just metal wings that make us fly," he said. "It's the wings of the heart, the ones that grow when we allow ourselves to truly be human with one another." Michael then began explaining the basic controls of the plane, his calm voice blending with the soft sounds of the morning. Thomas absorbed every word, every instruction, feeling that he was learning much more than simply how to fly. He was learning a new way of seeing the world, understanding the invisible connections that bind all stories, all dreams, all hearts that dare to believe in something greater than themselves. The small plane waited on the runway, shining under the morning sun like a promise. Michael carefully adjusted Thomas's seatbelt, explaining each detail with the patience of someone who understands that some moments are too sacred to rush. "Remember," Michael said softly, "the plane is like the earth, it responds to a gentle touch, to respect. Too much force scares it, but gentleness guides it." Emma watched from the side of the runway, her hands clenched together. Beside her, Lucy held what was left of the apple pie, the sweet aroma still lingering in the morning air. Richard and Robert stood a little farther away, their faces reflecting a mix of anticipation and reflection. "Before we start the engines," Michael continued, "I want you to close your eyes for a moment. Feel the plane under your hands, just like you felt the earth in your fingers when planting." Thomas obeyed, his calloused hands resting gently on the controls. In his mind, memories bloomed like a field in spring, Eleanor in her floral dress, dancing in the kitchen as she baked her pies, the first tractor they bought together, the birth of Rachel, their daughter, the smile of little Emma. "The first time I saw an airplane," Thomas shared, his eyes still closed, "I was 6 years old. My dad carried me on his shoulders so I could see better. He said, 'Son, never let anyone convince you that your dreams are too big.'" Michael smiled, starting the engines with precise movements. The gentle hum filled the air, not like a roar of machinery, but like a song, the music of dreams growing wings. On the side of the runway, Emma felt a presence beside her. It was Amanda Porter, the finance department employee who had shared her story the previous day. In her hands she held an old camera. "It belonged to my grandfather," Amanda explained softly. "He used to photograph birds. He said every flight was a different story waiting to be told." The plane began to move, gaining speed gradually. Thomas felt every vibration, every nuance of the movement. Michael guided his hands with gentle gestures, teaching not just the controls, but the language of the sky. "Now," Michael instructed, "pull the yoke gently. As if you're cradling a baby." The nose of the plane lifted and gravity pressed Thomas back into his seat. For a moment, a magical, eternal moment, he felt the exact instant when the wheels left the ground. It wasn't just metal and machinery rising, it was a 40-year-old dream taking shape. On the ground, the group watched in reverent silence. Lucy noticed a tear running down Richard's face, which he quickly wiped away with the back of his hand. "My father cried like that," Richard said softly. "The first time he took me flying. I was too young to understand at the time. Now I know, some tears carry more joy than sadness." The plane climbed in gentle circles, like a delicate dance with the wind. Michael allowed Thomas to feel every movement, every adjustment, every response of the aircraft. "Look," Michael pointed, "do you see that golden field down below?" Thomas looked through the window and his heart stopped for a moment. It was his farm, his land, a lifetime of work seen from a completely new perspective. The fields he had cultivated looked like a giant patchwork quilt, each piece telling a different story. "Eleanor was right," Thomas whispered, his voice thick with emotion. "From up here, everything seems part of something greater." On the ground, Robert approached Emma, handing her a yellowed envelope. "I found this morning in the oldest files at the dealership. I think you should see it." Inside the envelope was a letter dated 40 years ago. The handwriting was firm, decisive. "Dear Mr. Williams, I write to express my interest in purchasing one of your airplanes. I know I am just a woman who sells pies at the fair, but I have a dream. My husband Thomas and I have saved every penny we could. We don't have much, but we have faith. Faith in hard work, faith in each other, faith in dreams that seem too big for hearts as simple as ours. Please don't dismiss this request just because I come from humble beginnings. Some people might only see a baker, but inside me lives an adventurer, a dreamer, a woman who believes that the sky should not be the limit for anyone. Sincerely, Eleanor Thompson." Emma pressed the letter to her chest, her tears now flowing freely. Lucy approached, offering one of the napkins she had brought with the pie. "Your grandmother never gave up," Robert said softly. "My father kept this letter all these years. He used it as an example when interviewing new employees. He said it was the perfect definition of dignity." In the sky, the plane continued its graceful dance. Thomas was learning not only the controls and instruments but a new way of seeing the world. From above, where differences seemed smaller and connections more evident. "Look there," Michael pointed to a cloud formation ahead. "We're going through it." The plane gently plunged into the white mist. For a moment, everything became cloudy, like a dream within another dream. Thomas felt the moisture on his fingertips through the cabin glass. "Eleanor," he whispered, "we're touching the clouds, my love." When they emerged on the other side, the sun painted everything with a golden light. Below them, the city looked like a collection of toys, the dealership, the fair where it all began, the streets that had witnessed so many stories of love and loss, of dreams and new beginnings. "You know what my dad always said?" Michael shared, gently adjusting the controls. "That flying isn't about escaping the earth, it's about gaining a new perspective of it. It's about understanding that our roots don't bind us. They give us strength to reach new heights." Thomas nodded, deeply understanding the truth in those words. Eleanor always said something similar about her pies, that it wasn't just about the recipe, but about the love she put into them, about how that love touched people in unexpected ways. The flight continued for a few more precious minutes, each moment stored in his heart like treasure. When they finally landed, the entire group waited on the runway, no longer strangers brought together by circumstance, but an impromptu family, connected by something deeper than blood or social status. Emma ran to embrace her grandfather as soon as he stepped off the plane. In her hands, she still held Eleanor's letter, that testimony of love and determination that had waited 4 decades to be discovered. "Grandma knew," Emma said, her voice choked with emotion. "She always knew that one day you would fulfill this dream." Thomas looked at the group gathered around him. Lucy with her pie of love and memories, Richard with his own wounds in the process of healing, Robert with his search for redemption, Amanda with her camera full of untold stories, Michael with his gentle wisdom. "Eleanor was right about many things," he said softly. But mostly about this: the greatest miracles happen when we open our hearts to each other. 3 months after that first flight, the dealership had transformed in ways no one could have predicted. The showroom, once cold and impersonal, now displayed photographs on its walls, not just of luxury planes, but of real people and their stories. The biggest one, occupying the place of honor at the main entrance, showed Eleanor at her pie stand, her smile lighting up the entire space. On a particularly special morning, Thomas arrived earlier than usual. Today would be the day the small farmers financing program would officially launch. Lucy greeted him at the door, no longer the shy employee but a dear friend. "I brought something special today," she said, her eyes shining. In her hands was a handmade book, bound in simple but elegant leather. "It's a project I've been working on for the last few weeks." The title, embossed in simple gold letters, read, "Recipes from the Heart, a collection of love and memory." As Thomas opened the book, his heart stopped. There was the original recipe for Eleanor's apple pie, carefully preserved, next to Lucy's grandmother's recipe. Each employee contributed a family recipe, Lucy explained softly. And each recipe comes with a story. Richard Maxwell approached, his face softer than it had been 3 months ago. The transformation in him was perhaps the most visible. The once arrogant manager had become a kinder man, more connected to his own humanity. "My mother," he said, pointing to a page, "contributed the recipe for the cornbread my father loved so much. She said making that bread was her way of keeping him alive in our hearts." The meeting room was prepared for the launch event. Emma, now officially the dealership's legal consultant, had worked tirelessly in the past few months to structure the program. Every detail reflected the company's new philosophy, from the chairs arranged in a circle to the coffee served in simple ceramic cups. Robert entered the room leaning on a new cane, a gift from Thomas, made from the wood of an old apple tree from his farm. "Ready for the big day?" Thomas nodded, feeling the weight of the moment. In the past few weeks, as he learned to fly, he had also become something of an informal mentor at the dealership. Farmers who once would have felt intimidated to enter the place now sought him out, sharing dreams and stories. Amanda Porter, who continued documenting everything with her old camera, had created an impressive mural with photographs from the past months. Each image told a story of transformation, from Thomas's first flight to the small daily moments of human connection that now define the environment. "I have a surprise for everyone," Robert announced when the group was gathered. Carefully, he removed a cloth covering something on the main wall. It was a simple but elegant bronze plaque. "Eleanor Thompson Rural Aviation Institute, where dreams take flight and dignity finds its wings." Thomas felt tears welling up in his eyes. Emma took his hand while Lucy discreetly handed out napkins, a habit she had kept since that first day. "But there's more," Robert continued. He gestured, and Michael Harrison entered the room accompanied by an elderly woman whom Thomas immediately recognized. It was Richard's mother. "I found this last week," she said, her voice trembling with emotion, extending an old envelope. "It was in an album of your James, my husband. He kept it all these years." Inside the envelope was a photograph that no one had seen before. It showed a group of people in front of a small airplane, and there they were, Eleanor and Thomas, young and smiling, alongside Richard and Robert's parents. "It was taken the day Dad made that flight over the fair," Richard explained, his voice choked. He wrote something on the back. Thomas carefully turned the photo over. The handwriting, though faded, was still perfectly legible. "Today I met people who reminded me why the sky should belong to no one. Eleanor and Thomas Thompson, a couple who understands that dreams have no social class. Let this record serve as a reminder. True wealth lies in the smiles we plant and the dignity we preserve." The silence that followed was filled with the kind of emotion words can't capture. Lucy, ever sensitive to the moment, began serving slices of the pie she had brought, now a perfect blend of Eleanor's and her grandmother's recipes. "You know," Thomas finally said, his voice soft but steady, "Eleanor always said love is like yeast in dough. Sometimes it needs time to rise, but when it rises, it transforms everything it touches." Emma, who had been reviewing the final details of the program contracts, looked up. "Grandma also used to say that the best recipes are the ones we pass on. And that's exactly what we'll do here," Robert added. "We're not just financing airplanes, we're passing on a recipe for dignity, for respect, for humanity." As the first guests began to arrive, farmers from all around the region, some as shy as Thomas had been on that first day, something magical began to happen. The stories flowed naturally, blending together like the ingredients of a well-crafted recipe. A young farmer, hesitant on her first visit, found courage upon seeing Eleanor's photo on the wall. An elderly man, tasting Lucy's pie, shared memories of his own mother. Richard, now trained as a mentor for the program, welcomed each guest with a kindness that would have surprised himself from 3 months ago. Thomas watched it all with a heart overflowing. The dream of flying, which had begun as a whispered promise to Eleanor, had transformed into something much larger, a movement of change that touched lives in ways he had never imagined. At the end of that special day, as the sun was setting on the horizon, Thomas boarded his plane alone. It was a short flight, just to once again feel that special connection with the sky that Eleanor had always dreamed of. As he gained altitude, he thought about how a single moment of humiliation had turned into a catalyst for such deep change. The land he had sold to fulfill his dream was now helping others fulfill theirs. The pain he had felt on that first day at the dealership had transformed into healing for so many others. "See, Eleanor?" he whispered to the rosy sky. "Sometimes we have to lose something precious to gain something even more valuable. You always knew that, didn't you?" And up there, among the clouds he could now touch, Thomas felt Eleanor's presence stronger than ever. Not as a loss, but as a love that continued to grow, to transform, to create wings in hearts that dared to dream. When the story comes to a close, let's leave our special request. If you enjoyed this touching story, don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe to the Life Stories channel. Your comments mean a lot to us. Help our channel grow so we can bring even more inspiring stories like this one. Until next time.